Join Winnipeg Sports Talk, live from the NHL Draft in Las Vegas, presented by Coolbet, beginning on June 26th.
Murat, I thought we'd be talking about the Cup final and about the upcoming draft and some Jets off season, but what's your reaction to this breaking news? The 1 year experiment of PLD in LA is over, and he's being moved to the Washington Capitals.
I mean, it's an enormous trade. My goodness. And if you're a Jets fan, I can see it in the chat. Jets fans are just delighted by this. They're looking at Gabriel Velarde's season. They're looking at Iafallo and Kupari in the pick, and they're thinking to themselves, LA had to do what? Like, I think that Winnipeg Jets fans will remember this day with a certain amount of joy. I think that my perspective on this is that we have to remember what wild stakes LA was in right now, because PLD was going to hit that full no move starting on July 1st. Their contract that they signed him to, buyout might have worked now, but is essentially buyout proof from July 1st through the end of the contract with the no move and the 2/3 on such a big deal. So they needed to either decide that they were going to commit to the bet that they made on Dubois or get over him basically over the course of the next several days heading into July 1. And to think that they're taking a goalie who has had success, but who's getting a little up there and is seen as a little bit of an almost salary cap dump, like not the most effective money going the other way. That's a massive trade, and its outcome, the error bars are high. PLD could find it, sure. Kuemper could have the season of his life, sure. But the opposites are both possible for both players, and that's also super compelling.
You know, here's the crazy thing about Dubois and the buyout, is that right now, with his age, he's 25, he's eligible for the 1/3 buyout. That changes when he becomes 26 years old. He turns 26 on the 24th. Now,
days.
Wow. The buyout window doesn't open until, I believe it's 48 hours after the Stanley Cup final concludes. If the Oilers push this series to a 7th game, which is very much on the table after last night, he'll be 26 by the time that buyout window opens, which means the 1/3 buyout is no longer there. Now, the Kings have said publicly, believe what you want, that is not an option for, that's not an option for the Kings, and they weren't going to do that. But this is a way, let's face it, I mean, a buyout, you're just basically owning a mistake and picking it up. They found, the fact that they traded him for Darcy Kuemper makes me think that this still was very much on the table. They were looking for a way to almost get a mulligan on that trade. But they found a partner that, you know, with the trade of Kuznetsov, is looking for a center that has talent, that has lots of potential. And I think you could argue that the Washington Capitals, despite what they're taking on contract-wise, are really buying low on a guy that was thought a lot more highly of around the league a year ago when Kevin Cheveldayoff got what he did for PLD at the draft.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. I think you summarized it perfectly. And to mention his birthday about the buyout, this might be, it's crazy. And the Oilers win yesterday. I'm getting my days of the week wrong, but I watched it. Likely is why those talks picked up and moved to finalization, you know, today. That makes sense to me. Well said. And the idea, though, that they're buying low, the Washington Capitals, I think is exactly spot on. You can see the Kings get about $3.25 million of cap savings, in addition to the fact that they have a goalie, and we know a goalie is a big deal for them. But if you thought a year ago, 2 years ago, at any point that a team could acquire Pierre-Luc Dubois, who was still 25 years old until June 24th, 26 years old, through the heart of this career at $8.5 million for, I want to say, a throwaway, for a bit of a salary cap dump, a goaltender that you have replaced within the organization as well. If the Capitals hit on this, it will be seen as an enormously shrewd deal, like a bet on a buy low player. If they miss, I think everybody will understand the bet. Really, like if they miss and he's fine. Well, hey, the cap just went up compared to when the Kings signed him at 8.5. They'll still have the relatively young player or a mid-aged player or a prime-aged player at an important decision. He doesn't have to be that good for it to be a good trade for the Washington Capitals.
You know, I'm just I just pulled up the tweet from the Kings officially announcing the trade, and it's very simple. We've acquired goaltender Darcy Kuemper from the Washington Capitals in exchange for forward Pierre-Luc Dubois. And I'm just going through the comments, and you can imagine what's going on. Thank God. No way. We really escaped the PLD nightmare. I can't believe it. Throw a parade. This is amazing at LA Kings. Finally, some good news. Victory in LA Day. And then things like, thanks for nothing, PLD. It is truly stunning. When you think a year ago this week, we were in Nashville, that trade broke. We spent all of our time talking about what was coming back and the job that Kevin Cheveldayoff did in getting not just Gabriel Velarde, but Alex Iafallo, but Rasmus Kupari, and the Montreal pick that will be the first one made by the Winnipeg Jets unless they go into the first round with the deal at some point next week. It's just truly stunning at how terribly this went for Pierre-Luc Dubois after getting exactly what he wanted in LA with the Kings, and the fact that not even a year later, they're moving off this player essentially just to get him out of LA.
Yeah, if there was a different backstory on the player, if he hadn't gone through what he did in Columbus, asking his way out, if he hadn't been so sure on his way out of Winnipeg this whole time, you'd say, okay, a 25 turning 26-year-old player with his history, okay, he had a down year. So what? Great bet, Washington. But we're talking about a player on another fresh start. And the situation the Kings were in, trying to guess before his birthday comes up, like you said, is this guy going to be who we thought we were getting? There's time. Pierre-Luc Dubois' first couple of months in Winnipeg were awful. We remember that, right? Before he had some spurts eventually in his second and third year where he looked like a first-line center or sometimes a third-line center, or, they were hot and cold to him. LA had to know now. They had to make that decision now. And the idea that, how's this for numbers? Pierre-Luc Dubois in LA, 1.7 points per 60 minutes at 5-on-5. That's sort of like a middle 6-point scoring rate at 5-on-5. Well, on Winnipeg, that would put him behind Cole Perfetti, Vladislav Nemesnikov, Gabriel Velarde, Kyle Connor, Tyler Toffoli, Sean Monahan, Mark Scheifele, Nikolai Ehlers, and also Declan Chisholm, Brad Lambert, and Nikita Chibrikov in limited minutes. Just in terms of how things worked out, whether he had nights where he felt like he was on his game or not, the guy didn't produce like an $8.5 million player would. All that talk about finding that place that, I like Pierre-Luc Dubois' interest in the world around him, the fashion, the music, the film, the food. I love the idea of him being starstruck at Nobu Sushi in Los Angeles. I think that's just characterizing. But to go from a situation where, okay, the message is he's found his spot, he's at home, this is what he's always wanted, to this in less than a year is an absolute stunning turn. And what he does in Washington will decide. I mean, his legacy is half written at this point, but it'll decide if his final notes get written as a guy who just never was, or a guy who finally figured it out, which he does have time to do, albeit.
I mean, he is still signed until the end of the 30-31 season at $8.5 million a season. Now, as we continue moving forward and the salary cap goes up, that won't look like maybe as massive a number as it does right now. But it still is an incredible gamble made by the Washington Capitals. And when you think of the baggage that this guy's going to bring to DC, I mean, he can't be he can't lack self-awareness enough to not realize, the way this is going to be interpreted and said. Going to be a really unique amount and kind of pressure on Dubois because the Capitals need him. And I mean, we can say, hey, they're barely giving anything up to get him, they're committing to $8.5 million up until 2031. I mean, there's a huge risk involved on the cap side for a guy after things went so poorly last year. But man, is it going to be fascinating, the amount of pressure and the narrative around PLD right when training camp gets going. Everyone's going to say the right things. This is a big, fresh start. But I would say there'll be few people under more of a spotlight and a microscope game by game by game than PLD, even in a market like DC, which might not be like a Canadian market with that much attention on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like Washington, I would say, is on the downswing of their era as a franchise. Their Stanley Cup in 2018, they've been declining since then. They're a bit of a bubble team right now. I think the most compelling thing about Washington is the Ovechkin goals record watch, perhaps, and then the organization's attempts to sort of get out from under Ovechkin and into the next era of Capitals history. I think that's the most fascinating thing. So in theory, with a couple of years left on Ovi's deal, there's a little bit of Washington has a couple of years to get the good version of Dubois, a couple of years to figure out what his next era is. But that's the organization with, looking at it in a vacuum. With Dubois' history heading into this moment, the amount of fresh starts that he's had, the times that he's moved, and, obviously this one isn't his choice so much. It's the idea of an organization cutting bait on him a little bit early. There's so much scrutiny over him, just like you said, that even if I think he has kind of about a 2-year runway to figure his stuff out and become a more consistent version of himself before Washington is really pushing in the playoffs, I think that the amount of scrutiny on him, if he has a miserable first half of the season, like the emotional stress, the personal stress, he's got to be self-aware to realize that like his storyline as an NHL player is not going the way he would have dreamed of. And it's on him to fix that sooner. Even if I think the organization can wait, I think that pressure on him is going to be pretty incredible. His response to it, I think a lot of Jets fans are already pretty sure it won't go well. I have a little more patience, but he's got not too many years to figure this out at this point.
And listen, I mean, when it comes to covering the Caps, I mean, they certainly have daily beat writers and there's people that follow it. They've got, the Ovechkin story is going to keep them in the headlines. And who knows, maybe it'll be PLD playing with Ovi for a good portion of the game. They've got Dylan Strome. Looks like Nick Backstrom's sort of done. Kuznetsov's gone. The other way, though, this Darcy Kuemper going to the Kings, like, I'm not sure how much they expect they can get out of him. And I think that they'll be like, anything is a bonus. I mean, this is essentially taking all that cap money off. He's 5.25 for the next 3 years. Whether he makes it to the end of that contract, I guess we'll see. But the fact that the return was so low, the more I think about this, I think we're onto something here, that the buyout was very much in the cards. And this was the way they could make sure that they weren't up against it and all of a sudden dealing with a very different scenario if the Oilers push the Cup final to 7 games. I mean, what a stunning deal today in the National Hockey League. And just back to the noise around PLD, as I was mentioning, like, I don't think that there will be as much from the local media right off the bat, but he is not going to get the new market honeymoon from the national writers. Much like we in Winnipeg were paying very close attention to what was happening with him in LA, that exact same thing is going to be happening from that entire fan base to what's happening in DC. And he's sort of worn out. It's like a golfer. He's used his mulligans already, and it's time to get out and produce right out the gate. And he's going to be one of the most interesting players in the league to follow on a game-by-game basis right out of the gate next year, even on a team that isn't really considered a big-time playoff contender despite what they did this year. And it just adds at least one other story other than, is Ovi going to get his 42 goals?
Yeah, 100%. It's kind of like, when the uneducated come from somewhere outside of Winnipeg and they have their preconceived notions of what Winnipeg is, they don't bother always doing the homework to figure out what it actually looks like here or what the line combinations are. I think that might be the treatment from afar that Dubois gets from the national media, that this idea that they remember his backstory and his wanting out of 2 organizations, and then the way that he got to Washington. If he has a great 2 weeks, nobody's going to notice it. It's still all going to be in terms of the way that he got there.